want to have fun playing with a band, enjoying the music, and feeling relaxed and creative, you must eliminate fear of mistakes. That's got to be the biggest thing. That's got to be the biggest issue holding so many drummers back. But you don't have to fear this. You don't have to fear this because there are lots of ways to not only avoid mistakes, but also to hide them when they inevitably happen. Today, I'll share with you the two biggest types of mistakes that drummers make all the time. You're gonna relate to probably both of these. And we'll break down the 5 best tricks for hiding these mistakes on the fly during a gig. This is gonna be fun. You can do this. Hey, welcome to The Non-Glamorous Drummer. I'm so glad you're hanging out with me today. I am here to help you become the drummer everybody wants to play with. A drummer that sounds musical and creative and confident and is just laying it down and nailing songs. And we do that by learning the core drumming skills that really matter that help you get quick results. And speaking of quick results, I want you to check out my free PDF e-guide, my free gift to you. It's called 5 Steps to Learning Any Song in Under an Hour. We want to be able to learn and memorize songs, and we want to be able to do it quickly by ear. The problem is that we just can't seem to pull this off because we're having to use drum tabs and sheet music. We're having to look up YouTube tutorials, and all of that is so time consuming. And so if we can learn to do this by ear, where you can just sit down, just you, headphones, pencil and paper, and learn a song that way, that's going to save you so much time. So this is a repeatable 5-step method to learn any rock song, country song, pop song, pretty much any song you're going to play on a gig. You're going to be able to learn this song in under an hour and eventually whittle down this process to 15 minutes with this repeatable process. I've used this for thousands of gigs, a whole bunch of songs, probably 1,000 songs. I've written so many of these cheat sheet charts. It's going to help you out a bunch, so be sure to dig into that. All right, on with today's lesson. A little later, I'm going to share with you a story of a fill that I totally botched recently while I was playing at church. And so it's kind of a funny story. I'll share with you how I did my best to hide that mistake. So we'll get to that a little later. We're going to first talk about the 2 biggest mistakes that drummers make all the time. If we can classify every main drummer mistake into 2 categories, these are the categories, and then we'll break down each of those. And in discussing each of those main types of mistakes, we'll go through these 5 tricks for best hiding your mistakes. And so this is going to be super actionable, even though this is kind of conceptual, but I'm going to give you some very clear resources and tips and strategies for working to overcome fear of mistakes, because that's what this comes down to. We've all got fears, we've got insecurities, we've got doubts, and those are the deep things we've got to deal with and that we've got to work to not only hide, but actually deal with. But if we can learn to hide them, if we can learn to fake it till you make it in a way, that can help give us the confidence to begin overcoming these fears. So let's get into this. So 2 biggest types of mistakes drummers make all the time. The first one is losing the beat types of mistakes. So this is just a typical kind of mistake where you're playing and you just lose it. You get distracted or you hit something in the wrong way at the wrong time. Most often, though, you go into a fill and you get lost during the fill, or maybe going out of the fill. You don't quite hit the downbeat when you need to, and you kind of lose the band, and there's a little bit of friction there. We'd call that the losing the beat kind of mistake. Very common for sure. We've all made that mistake many times. The second one, though, messing up an arrangement. That type of mistake where we meant to go into the bridge, but we stayed on our chorus pattern, and then we've got to go, oh, wait a second. Or maybe we're supposed to drop down, but we kept playing. Or maybe we were supposed to stay up, but we dropped out, and the band's still going at it, and we're like, oh, wait a second, let's get back in here and get going. That's a very common kind of mistake, too. So my guess is that you can relate to both of these, and that if you've spent any amount of time jamming with people, rehearsing with a band, playing with a cover band, playing at your church, you've been in these 2 kinds of mistakes. And so I think we've all been there. But there's a big overarching skill that honestly helps a lot with avoiding these kinds of mistakes, dealing with them in the moment, and avoiding performance anxiety. And it's listening. The better you can listen, the more you can be in the moment, really listening and really paying attention to what's going on around you, the less worried you're going to be because you're actually enjoying the music and you're immersing yourself in it. And so you're not so worried about yourself and how you're sounding and whether or not you're going to mess up. You're more you're having a good time. You're making music. And so that's kind of the overarching thing, active listening and being aware of what's going on around you. I want you to have that in the back of your head because that's kind of something that we're getting at and that we're going to be working towards throughout everything we talk about today. The first big type of mistake, the losing the beat kind of mistake. Let's talk about a couple ways to avoid it. And then we're going to get into these tricks for how to hide it in the moment, because the thing is, mistakes are inevitable, and so we do need to work to avoid them as much as possible, but we have to know this truth that mistakes are going to happen. Any seasoned professional musician will tell you that mistakes happen all the time. And sometimes it's things out of their control, like something that goes on over here, something goes wrong with the technical side of things at a show, and you've got to learn how to deal with it. So mistakes are inevitable. Things are going to go wrong, and so we want to learn how to hide them. But here's a couple ways to avoid, as far as the losing the beat kind of mistakes. Number one, don't play a fill you haven't practiced or carefully planned out in your head. Don't play a fill that you haven't thought through beforehand. Now, I say that kind of preaching to my beginner self. Back when I first started playing, I would make that mistake of launching into a fill that I just had no idea what I was doing, and my hands were just going at it, and oh, I hope this works out. I hope I hit the downbeat. There we go, and okay, nobody died. We're good. And that was kind of my approach a lot of times, which is really not good. Now, eventually you get to a point in your playing where you have a level of mastery over the instrument where you don't have to rehearse and practice every fill. You can improvise, because that's what we want to go ultimately as we learn the drums. We want to be able to improvise so that we're not having to think through every detail of what we're going to play. But even then, you're still mentally hearing what you're about to play. You're thinking through, all right, I want to play this rhythm that fits with this melody. And so everything's very intentional. So across the board here, we want everything to be intentional. We either want to be thinking through, what am I about to play? Or maybe if you're in the early stages of drumming, you're trying to get comfortable on the instrument, make sure you've practiced what you're going for. Like if you're playing a ga ga doom 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 ba ba, make sure that you're comfortable with that kind of fill, that you know you can play that in time and smoothly. Whether or not it's exactly like that, maybe you've practiced some variations of a certain fill. Make sure you're comfortable with that so you can confidently go into it and know that there aren't going to be mistakes because you're super solid with it because you've practiced it a bunch. And when you're at the level where you can improvise a little more, always have an idea in your head of where you're going with it. Don't just blast into a fill and play from your hands. Be listening, playing from your ear, from your mind, and thinking through what kind of idea am I trying to convey here. That's going to help you a lot. And that was a big turning point for me. So being intentional and always deciding what you're going to play and sticking with it and not just going into random craziness that ends in train wrecks a lot of times. Second way to avoid, this is very technical and very simple, but make sure your singles are smooth and rebound driven so that your sticks go on autopilot while you're playing. This is so simple, and if you've watched many of my videos, you've noticed how we end up landing on this so many times, where at the end of a lesson, I'm like, all right, guys, here's the overarching thing we all need to be doing, practice your singles, because it's so crucial. It's so important, because if you don't have your grip on autopilot, where the sticks are rebounding on autopilot, where, say, we've got our practice pad here, and we're just playing singles, this needs to be autopilot, where I'm not having to think about my grip. I'm not having to think about time. It's just like when you're bouncing a basketball or you're jumping on a trampoline, it's going to happen steadily. Just like when you're walking, your pace is going to be a steady pace. You don't have to think about walking steadily when you're walking because you're in a repetitive motion. Same with the sticks, where if you get going like this, you don't have to try that hard to stay in time because it's this relaxed rebound. And so when you've got your grip squared away, when you've got your fulcrum here and you've got the stick hinging, I'll link some additional resources more in depth about this, then you're going to be just fine. And that's going to put your hands on autopilot. And so when your singles are smooth and your hands are on autopilot, this is big. This allows you to relax. This allows you to physically relax, which helps you mentally relax and enjoy the music and pay attention to what's going on around you and not be freaked out and stiff and tense, because if you're stiff and tense, nothing you play is going to sound good, no matter how much you've prepared and no matter how well you've learned the songs. So you've got to be relaxed, and that relaxation starts with just the physical mechanics of this kind of motion, just getting that rebound. That's so important. Number one thing you can be practicing. If this isn't quite right, focus on this, work on this every day until it is, because it's going to reap dividends in your playing and in your performing and in how well you sound with a band for sure. So that's extremely important, making sure your hands can be on autopilot. So now let's talk about how to cover up these kinds of mistakes. Those are ways to set yourself up for success in avoiding these mistakes in fills where we're playing a fill at a time or we're losing the beat. But let's talk about some ways to cover up. So we've got our 5 tricks for hiding mistakes. Here's number 1. No matter what happens in a botched fill, land the downbeat on time. So no matter how badly the fill goes, no matter what happens in the middle of that measure or near the end of that measure where you're playing the fill, make sure that you hit the downbeat on time. When I say downbeat, I mean beat 1. Beat 1 of the next measure. So if you're playing a 4/4 groove and you're going 1 and 2 and 3 and ba 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 ba. There's beat 1 of the next measure, or 1, 2 and 3 and 1. So that 1 is where most of the time your fill is going to finish. Most of our fills, just practically speaking, we're going to hit a crash on beat 1. Make sure that you land that crash on beat 1. Make sure you're paying attention to the time and where you're at, so that even if your hands fail you, even if your hands mess up, maybe you're playing an uncomfortable house kit and the rack time's way over here, like you hit a rim and you drop a stick, something goes haywire, just make sure you hit the downbeat on time. If you do that, the band will stay exactly with you. The audience will probably never know that anything went wrong, and you'll just keep going. It won't matter. It'll be okay. Now, it takes some time to develop the sense of internal time that you need to really do this well. So I want to give you some tips for doing that. A great way to develop your sense of internal time, where as you're playing, no matter what you're playing, you're just hearing the, you're feeling that pulse. Like the heartbeat of the music, you're feeling that. It's not that you're hearing like a clicking in your head, that would be annoying, but you're feeling the passage of time and you're feeling steady time. When you're able to do that, this whole thing of landing the downbeat on time gets a lot easier. A great way to do this is to practice to a sparse click. When I mean sparse click, I mean set your click to not play gun, 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 but first set it to just play quarter notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, if you haven't done that much, if it makes you uncomfortable. Then set it to just half notes where it's just clicking on 1 and 3. 1, 3, 4. That's a little harder to play with, especially if you're going slower. 100 beats a minute, like 85 to 100 is usually a good range to practice this. But set it to just 1 and 3, groove along to it. And if that's too difficult, if you feel like, I don't know if I can get there yet and actually groove with it, just play singles. Just play singles on your pad. Just 8th note singles with that sparse click. There's a really great app that I've become a big fan of. It's called Gap Click. It was developed by Benny Greb, and what it does is you can set it up to play a measure of click and then a measure of silence, or however many measures of click, however many measures of silence. Really great tool for practicing this, where you can have the click going and then suddenly the click is out from under you, but it's going to come back in exactly in time. So it's a great way to test your time and to build that internal sense of time, where you're actually learning to listen more to yourself than to the metronome. And that's the point here. As you're weaning yourself off the metronome, you're learning to listen more to yourself, feel the time more, and not have to hear an incessant clicking dictating the time to you. You don't want to have to rely on the click. You want the click to be a guide for you, and you want to be able to still play with a good time if that guide is ripped out from under you. So that's really key. Practice to a sparse click. Check out Gap Click. It's a couple dollars, but it's well worth it. Practice building that internal sense of time, because that's going to help you recover from a botched fill for sure. Trick number 2, along those lines, whatever happens in the fill, whatever happens in that mistake, play a strong snare flam on beat 4 to cue the band back in. So maybe you're going into a fill. So maybe it goes totally haywire and it's a mess, and you realize, okay, I've totally lost the time here. Like maybe I've just totally messed up this fill and there's no chance of recovering, and now I'm not sure where the downbeat is. Because that's what can happen sometimes, where it's like, wait a second, I've lost the time. I don't know where the downbeat is, but the band's got to come in with me. What do you do in that moment? Play a snare flam on beat 4. 4, boom. Nothing fancy, literally just bop, boom. That is the most obvious cue you could possibly play to make sure the band lands on a downbeat with you. So just bop, boom. So no matter what happens in the fill, I don't know where I am, bah, crash. And it's totally clean. It almost sounds intentional. You can totally hide a mistake that way. That's so important, especially if you're not playing to a click. Most of the time, most gig scenarios, you're not going to be playing to a click or to tracks. That's become a very common thing in church now. If you're playing like modern worship music, you might be playing to a click and tracks. And depending on what kind of cover band you might play with, you guys might use a click. But most of the time, there's no click. You don't have that metronome in your ears, and so you are the metronome. And so you've got to be the metronome. You've got to cue the band in and make sure everybody lands together. So snare flam on beat 4, it will save your life. Trick number 3, and this can actually help you avoid the scenario just now where you have to save the band by playing a flam on beat 4. If you can keep your left foot chicking on the hats, then no matter what happens, maybe you combine that with the previous trick. You've got the hi-hat chicking over here. That's the metronome, so you can keep yourself in time, and then you could still play that flam on beat 4 if you have to. Or maybe you're just in the middle of like a tom pattern or something, you're doing a tom groove. It's a great glue to hold things together, where a little mistake there where it's like, I didn't mean to do that, or I accidentally dropped a stick or threw a stick. If you can keep the hats going, that gives you a chance, number one, to reach down and grab another stick, or just to recover, mentally recover, because you've got this leg bounce that's going on that's keeping you in time. Now, that's a topic for another video, which I will link in the description. We've got a lesson specifically about this, so you can check it out. It definitely requires some coordination, and it's not easy at first if you've never done it, to bounce your left leg so that your hi-hats chick and function as the metronome for the band. That can be so helpful to a lead singer. I've played in church for years, and this kind of thing has been so helpful to a lot of worship leaders. Maybe they don't have a click in their ears, maybe I'm playing to a click. So if I can just sit here and do some of this whenever we get real quiet, just so the band can hear where the time is and we're all like visually locked in. This is like a visual metronome right here. Like a conductor sitting here and conducting, that can be so helpful, and that can be a really powerful tool. So if you want to check that out, definitely check out the lesson on the leg bounce in the description, because if you can learn to do that, that can help you save yourself from mistakes for sure. All right, second biggest type of mistake that we mentioned earlier, missing an arrangement cue. So just messing up an arrangement, going into a chorus too late or too early, or dropping out, or building too soon, all those kinds of mistakes where maybe what we're playing sounds totally fine, but we're just not in sync with the band because we messed up an arrangement. Very common kind of mistake. First, let's talk about a couple ways to avoid. Number one, have a solid chart written that notates length of sections. Now, I know some of you are like, Steven, I want to memorize songs. I don't want to read charts. I hate drum tabs and sheet music. I'm right there with you. I hate sheet music. I hate reading charts. I hate reading while I'm playing drums. We'll just be honest. Sometimes I'm in a scenario where I have to. I have no choice. But if I can, I will write my cheat sheet chart. So it's a condensed chart that makes it easy. So I'm not having to read. I'm just taking a couple visual cues from my piece of paper, and I'm playing and focusing on the music. That's what I want you to do. If you're not, if you're unfamiliar with this, if you've never really gotten into this territory, I want you to check out that guide I mentioned earlier about 5 steps to learning any song in under an hour. If you're learning a song for a gig, like a pop song, rock song, country song, you can totally do this, where you can write yourself a simple chart that will notate the sections, so like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, typical pop song format, and the length of each section. That's what you want to notate. And when you've got that on paper, maybe you've memorized the song because it's a simple song, but you've got those visual cues just to remind you, oh yeah, that guitar solo is 8 bars, not 4 bars, before I drop down into the down chorus. Or there's a down chorus here after the bridge, not an up chorus. We don't keep going, we drop out. Those little cues can be so helpful and can help you a lot with actually memorizing the song. If our goal is memorization, a lot of times we can aid that memorization by writing out a cheat sheet chart. That's been so helpful to me, and that's something I teach all the time. Definitely check out the free e-guide about that, because that might really help you too. So that'll help you avoid arrangement mistakes. That's really helped me a lot in avoiding arrangement mistakes. I can honestly say that it's rare that I make this kind of mistake because of this system that I've been using for literally thousands of gigs and hundreds of songs. It's very, very reliable and very much a confidence booster for sure. Now, along those lines, another tip, this is something that I learned from my all-time favorite session drummer, studio guy, Aaron Sterling. He talks about this memorization system he has, and I won't go into all the detail about it, but the whole concept is what he wants to do. He doesn't write charts, doesn't read charts, though he could. He doesn't. He just wants to focus on playing and not have to worry about all that. And so basically his memorization method is based on expectation and based on, all right, there's something in the bridge that I did not see coming. So I'm going to make a mental note of that. Everything else in the song was exactly what I thought it would be. Therefore, I'm not going to worry about it. So it's the whole concept of if everything is predictable in the song, you don't really need to worry that much about it if it's naturally what you're going to play and what you're expecting. But if something out of the ordinary comes up and there's like, oh, this weird dropout and okay, that was strange, then you want to make a note of that and just worry about remembering that part. You don't have to remember every detail of the whole song. Just remember that weird thing that happens in the bridge, or that weird breakdown that happens where like the band changes key and something crazy happens. If you just make notes of that, then that can help a lot with memorizing, because you don't need to remember all of it. You just need to remember the parts. Just need to remember whatever that was. You just need to remember the parts that are actually weird, that caught you by surprise. And so that can be a really helpful tool for memorizing. And the third way to avoid these kinds of arrangement mistakes, it goes back to that overarching thing that we talked about earlier. Back at the beginning, I mentioned listening. If you're able to listen to what's going on around you, that is so powerful because you can take cues from the other band members. Remember that you're not in isolation. When you're playing a gig, it is not 100% just you, and you've got to remember everything, and you've got to do all the things, you've got to not mess up. It's a group effort. And so when you're listening to the lead singer, when you're listening to your worship leader, when you're playing at church, when you're paying attention to everything else going on around you, it's not as difficult to know the arrangement as you might think because you're able to feel what's coming next, especially the more you do this. The more you learn songs, play with people, you start to learn these things. And when you're playing with the same group of people all the time, whether, again, cover band at your church, if you're playing with the same people, you'll start to learn their tendencies and they'll become predictable. So you'll always be able to read them and know what's coming next. And so I hope that can be a little bit of a stress reliever there, knowing that over time you start to learn situations and feel things out so you don't have to worry so much. But as far as the listening goes, that's a skill that you build over time. And it's easier to focus on listening when you've got your hand technique squared away, when you're working your coordination, so you're not having to think so much about you and your limbs and what you're playing, but instead you're able to listen more. So it's kind of that third piece of the puzzle, hand technique and coordination and then listening. And so all those things work together, but listening is really the icing on the cake that can't happen until the main physical mechanical skills are in place. So always be focusing on that hand technique. Always be focusing on building your coordination, doing whatever exercises you're working on. There's a whole bunch of stuff here on the channel about coordination, so check that out. And as those things are being elevated, that's going to make it easier to focus on listening. Now let's talk about how to cover up these kinds of mistakes. So far we've covered 3 different tricks that were there in the losing the beat, messing up a fill category of mistakes. We've got 2 tricks here in the missing an arrangement cue category. And these can seem a little bit ambiguous just because there's so many different variations and ways you can do this, but I'll explain. So remember what we were talking about earlier, how everything that you play needs to sound intentional. Everything you play needs to sound intentional. So if you can think through a fill before you play it, that means you can be intentional about it. Know what kind of rhythm or melody you're wanting to play and know what you're going to do before you do it. That greatly decreases your chances of making a mistake. So keeping that in mind, everything you play needs to sound intentional. So how can you make an arrangement mistake sound intentional? Well, here's some ideas. These are things that I've done before on so many cover gigs where maybe we're playing songs that we haven't really rehearsed, or like somebody in the crowd is like, hey, we want to hear Prince, and so we're like throwing together a Prince tune, or hey, y'all know more Dave Matthews Band, and we're trying to remember a Dave Matthews song we haven't played in forever. And so that's where these kinds of mistakes are going to happen, and they're honest mistakes, and it's going to happen because depending on what kind of cover gig you're doing, you might not be able to know the arrangement really well. You might be kind of flying by the seat of your pants. So you have to be ready to hide these mistakes. So here's our trick number 4. Turn the groove into a big fill that leads into the real start of the next section. This is if you come into something a measure early. Let's say there's an extra measure before a chorus. So imagine you've got to hold out a little longer before you go into a chorus. But let's say you drop out too early. So you're grooving, boom, 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 and then you suddenly realize, oh wait, the band's still going. We've got to go a little bit longer here. Go into a fill that sounds very intentional that leads into the real start of the next section. So it literally might just look like this. You're playing along. And that sounds totally intentional. You dropped out a measure early and then you suddenly realize, oh, they're still going, boom. Or boom, 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 boom. Do a build, something simple. It doesn't have to be anything complicated. Best ways to hide mistakes are always going to be very simple. Don't go into anything complex here. Be as simple as possible, just like the whole snare flam thing, cueing in the band. Very simple, works all the time. So if you drop out a measure early, do some kind of build or a fill or something to then go into where you're actually supposed to drop out. I've done this so many times, and it'll get a laugh from your band members. They'll probably notice the mistake, but the audience, they're probably not going to notice, especially if it's not a super familiar song. So many times this works 100%. Now, what if you kept playing when you were supposed to drop out? So maybe you missed something like that, like you kept playing a particular groove when you were supposed to switch to another groove, or you're supposed to drop out and you kept playing. This is where you can kind of take that same concept, but trick number 5, allow the first measure to be some sort of fill that leads to a hit on beat 2 or 4 of that first measure, which will sound intentional if you do it well. So let's say we're supposed to drop out after one measure. So let's say this is what it's supposed to be. That's what it's supposed to be, but let's say I play a little bit too long. I could either do that and just crash out a couple beats later, or I could play something more like this. And play a crash on beat 2 of the next measure. So if I realize right there in that moment, oh wait, I was supposed to go out here, just do a big hit on beat 2, and sometimes that works well. Or if you need a little bit more time, you could wait till beat 4 and you could play something like this. Point is, it's going to be a little bit different for every song, and there's not a one-size-fits-all. That's why I said these can be a little bit, they can seem a little bit ambiguous, but to review, the idea here is that if you come in a measure early, or like you drop out a measure early, play an intentional fill that then keeps things going. So it hides the fact that, oh, you quit when you weren't supposed to, and leads into what you're supposed to be doing. So an intentional fill or a build or something. Or if you end up being late to a section, and so you just keep playing when you're not supposed to, then just go out on beat 2 or go out on beat 4. Or you could even fade out. You could do something like this. That's something else I've done so many times where I'll realize, oh, I was supposed to stop there, so I'll kind of fake my way into like a boom, kind of slowly, quietly crash my way out. The idea here is to stay as musical as you can, stay in the moment, stay in the feel of it, in the mood of it, and don't play anything abrupt. What you want to do is just think, fluid, smooth. How can I best serve this song and hide this mistake and not take away from anything? How can I just kind of blend in and gloss this over as best as I can? And so you want to think smooth dynamics, either getting louder to get back into something or getting softer to then fade out. Because that's the thing, a lot of times with drums, we're here and we're suddenly going to here, or maybe we're here and suddenly we're in up here, and we miss those spots and we think it's the end of the world because we messed up a big entrance or a big exit. But you can also ramp into something, you can also dive off of something. So you do what you got to do, and it's okay to fade out or to fade in if you've messed up. The idea is to make it nice and smooth and just act like it was intentional. If you can keep that intentionality in mind, that's how you hide mistakes. So listen well, be intentional. Listen well and be intentional. I think those are the two biggest things that I want to be the takeaways here. Now, a couple of final thoughts to leave you with. I'm going to share that quick story about the fill that I messed up recently. Pretty funny. So hiding mistakes is a learned skill, and it's one that takes years to master. So I want you to take it easy on yourself. I want you to be patient. I want you to know that everything I've shared with you today, these are ways that have helped me and have helped my students deal with hiding mistakes, and it's been a huge confidence booster. It's definitely helped me deal with a lot of that self-doubt, a lot of the insecurities and the fear of mistakes that come with playing on a stage with musicians who are maybe better than me and in front of people that I feel are going to be watching and listening. But so many times you just need to relax, be in the moment, enjoy making the music, and know that mistakes are going to happen. These are some great tips for hiding them. And so keep these things in mind and be ready to use these. Every professional drummer makes mistakes, but the best players have gotten really good at hiding them. That's why most of the time, like a top-level touring act, you're not going to notice any mistakes. Most likely, especially the average listener, will not notice mistakes. You as a musician, as a drummer, maybe you can notice something, but my guess is that you're never going to see a train wreck. You're never going to see a great band train wreck, because no matter how bad of a mistake happens, they're all listening and they know how to cover for each other. They know how to hide mistakes and blend back in, ease out, whatever kind of intentional, subtle kind of thing that you've got to do to keep things smooth and musical. That's the goal, staying musical and sounding intentional. So know that this takes time. Work at it, but be patient, because I remember making so many obvious mistakes when I was in high school, and I just had to log the hours playing with people, playing on a stage, playing with bands, and over time you get better and better at these things. So recently I was playing in church, and we were at this big climactic moment of this song, and there was a super fast fill I had to play. And this was a fill that I had practiced it, I worked to make sure I knew what my sticking was going to be. It was just a quick, like real fast around the kit, and then cues the band back into a big groove, big and epic. So it shouldn't have been a problem, except the problem was that I'd had an out-of-town gig that weekend, and I'd gotten in at 5 a.m. that morning. Now, I don't have an early call time at my church, which is really nice. It's definitely a blessing to not have to be there at 6:30 every morning, like I know a lot of church drummers do, or even 7:30. So I was still able to get a couple hours of sleep, but not near enough. And so I'm rolling on, 2, maybe 3 hours of sleep, not feeling very good, definitely in a fog as I'm playing. And I remember like just feeling like I was out of it and that I was just watching myself play a song and not really being aware of what I was playing, which is kind of a scary thing. Definitely not something that I wish on myself or on anybody. You got to get your sleep as best as you can. So I was kind of in a fog, and I kind of knew coming up on this moment in the song, I kind of knew that I'm not so sure my hands are going to pull this off because I'm already exhausted from the rehearsal earlier and everything else we've already played today because this was at the end of the set. What I should have done, was simplified. And so that might be the moral of the story here, simplify. So I get to the fill, and I launch into it, and then suddenly my left hand like doesn't make it up to the rack tom. It like hits the rim or something. The stick just doesn't make it. It hits a mic. Something funny happens, and the fill just stops. It's almost like mentally I'm still playing it, but I realize my hands are not even doing anything. It's like my hands have stopped. What's going on here? So in that moment, I had to make sure, all right, we got to land the downbeat. Otherwise, if I don't land the downbeat, it's all over because we're playing to a click and we're playing to tracks. The worst thing you can do in that situation is go off the click and off the tracks. So because we had a click and a track going, I knew, all right, that's somewhat of a safety net as long as I hit the downbeat. So it went boom, bam, right there on beat 1. We were all back in together. And I haven't listened back to the recording of that, but I'd like to think that unless the drums were like really hot in the mix where you could hear them really well, I'd like to think that it was barely noticeable because I started it and then landed the downbeat on time. So it kind of just sounded like so it definitely wasn't epic and cool like it was supposed to be, but I was able to hide the mistake pretty well by landing the downbeat on time. And that's why that was our number 1 trick today. That was the first trick that came to mind because that's something I've done so many times when I messed up a fill, something's gone wrong, just hit the downbeat on time. And if there's no click that's cueing the band in, make sure you play that snare flam. You'll be totally fine. So I hope that this was encouraging to you. I hope this was motivating to you, empowering, because I don't want you to fear mistakes. I want you to go out there. I want you to be the church drummer that you're made to be, or the cover band drummer you're made to be. I want you to be able to jam with people and have fun and be creative without having to fear mistakes, because that will hold you back. Don't let fear of mistakes hold you back. Mistakes are going to happen. But don't let the fear be there. Don't let the fear hold you back. Know that you can deal with this. You can work to hide these things. And the more you work at this, the more that deep-seated insecurity and self-doubt, the more that'll start to go away. And so there are deep things that we have to deal with here, if we're honest. There are deep emotional things we have to deal with when it comes to performance anxiety and fearing different things. But when you know how to deal with something when it's going to happen, it's kind of like emergency preparedness. You know what the plan is. You know how you're going to solve it when it happens. You know how you're going to deal with it. That really lessens the stress a bunch. So I hope this helps you out. Let me know how this helps you out. Leave a comment below. Shoot me an email. And be sure to grab that guide. Be sure to grab the 5 Steps to Learning a Song in Under an Hour guide, because that helps a lot with preparedness, helps a lot with listening. I think that guide is going to be very powerful toward helping you out with this and giving you something tangible you can download and print off and dig into, really dive into. It's got a lot of practical, actionable exercises you can do to really increase your listening. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for hanging out today. It always means a lot when you hang out for a long video like this where we're going deep and we're talking about fear and we're talking about dealing with it. But I love these kinds of lessons. So I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you on the next lesson. Have a great week. Stay non-glamorous.